Hello and welcome to Technically Speaking, where scientists and engineers come together to chat about a common interest, share knowledge and satisfy some curiosity. I'm Laura, and I'm joined by Sarah and Antonia to talk about artificial intelligence and how it could be used in healthcare to help with diagnostics, or what else it might do for medicine. So, Antonia, I think the inspiration for this episode started off with you, so tell us about it.
So I was reading an article and the headline said ChatGPT 4 can pass the US GP medical exam. And I thought, interesting. We've heard all sorts of things coming out of ChatGPT. And I thought about one of my friends has recently passed her GP exam in the UK. Maybe it'd be a good time to talk about it.
Fair enough, and that's you, Sarah. So you're a medical professional, so do you have any thoughts about this?
Just a caveat, I actually haven't passed my GP exam yet. I've passed my GP entrance exam, so it's the exam to get into GP training. So I'm both a medical professional and a surgical educator. My initial response to AI, or the concept of AI passing these exams, is it threatens my job. So that's my immediate gut reaction. And I also know that it's going to be heavily invested in because the NHS will need to reduce workforce costs over time. So I think that it's definitely going to be an area of interest in the future.
All right, and I guess one big question there is it better to have an AI doctor or GP or surgeon even, or is it better to have a human doing that job, and what's the difference? So I guess we should start, as we always do in this show, with defining what AI is. Now, I know it's something that needs to be trained by feeding it data, but I don't really have much experience with that. I've never used ChatGPT. I've heard a lot about it, but I don't know how any of these things actually work. So have you guys got any experience of AI or have a better definition?
I don't have a definition as much as just AI stands for artificial intelligence. And I think it gets mixed with some other terminology like machine learning and neural networks. And I think those are two of the key tools that are making up the AI that we see around at the moment, such as in ChatGPT or Bing's search engine is now also AI powered. And my experience is we've got a bunch of data and fed it into the machine, as it were, and told it to either identify patterns or replicate something and try to do the next iteration that follows based on that information it's been given. And so it's learning, and sometimes it will develop a new way to pick up those patterns. And so it becomes its own teacher in that we're not telling it exactly what pattern it should be reading. The neural network, I think, helps it combine more things, so it's not just a set data set. That's my understanding as someone who isn't in computer science.
I'm also not in computer science, but I think that the term artificial intelligence is a bit of a misnomer because it's only as intelligent as the information that we feed it. So it is based on the data that we give it. It can't create its own new data, and it only learns as much as we reinforce that learning. It can't reinforce its own learning, if that makes sense.
Or if it does, it creates its own feedback loop, and in which case it has its own biases that will get amplified as it goes through more and more iterations. In a popular culture example, I want to say it was Twitter that tried an AI on people's tweets, and then it found it got more aggressive, more racist, more bigoted, that they had to shut it down within a very short time frame because they realized that what people put on the internet should not be repeated and amplified.
This is something that I think is important to consider when we talk about bias in healthcare and bias in AI, because any data that we put into it, any bias that we put into it will be perpetuated. And there's already something that I'm very passionate about is equity in healthcare. And any inequities that currently exist in healthcare is only going to be perpetuated by this AI. It can't go against any of the societal prejudices that we have.
One of the things that's important to me is critical thinking. So the ability to take in information and weigh it against other information and say, well, does that match what I already know about a particular thing? Or am I spotting some sort of pattern or something that doesn't fit into that pattern? that doesn't make sense that I should be questioning. I don't know if AI has that same capability to think critically about something and decide whether something is true or correct or appropriate or not.
I don't know, is the honest answer. I think it's able to say this doesn't fit the patterns I've been fed, but able to truly assimilate knowledge and create new theories, I don't think so.
I think it'd be interesting because, Asimov's law of robotics, we put some certain rules in to ensure, the safety and security of our future as we developed robotics at the time. I'm not going to repeat them because I don't remember them off the top of my head. But I wonder if we do put those barriers in, can we put those barriers in a non-biased way, but also isn't too restrictive? Because then there's that idea that you've put in a limitation, but then does that create other consequences that we didn't foresee when we release it out into the world, and actually it has a complete blind spot because we said you're not allowed to think about X, so then never thinks about X.
I guess it depends what you're using it for. I guess pop culture example is iRobot. This robot was sort of almost like a human being and seemed to be doing certain things and seemed really independent. But a more practical example of what artificial intelligence can be used for is, I think I saw something a while ago now, I've mentioned it in a previous episode, about training AI to be able to tell when a tumour is cancer or not based on an image of it. And it was actually better at doing it than the specialists who had been using these images to try and diagnose cancer for decades, maybe. And it seemed like the AI had been fed sufficient data that it could spot, I guess, really subtle clues in the images that sometimes a person might miss because they're tired or they've not eaten or they're just having a really bad day or they're distracted by something. AI doesn't forget and it doesn't get distracted necessarily. So I can see how in that instance it's a lot more useful than just doing some big picture out in the real world doing everything thing.
Yeah, so for focused tasks, absolutely. And that specifically, I was talking to some histopathologists, some colleagues of mine who to explain the term, basically they're the people when you take a tumour out, you send it off to the lab. They're the lab people that then slice it up and look at it under a microscope and tell you what is in that biopsy. So I was speaking to some of them, and they were saying that actually the way that they study for their exams is purely by looking at hundreds and hundreds of slides, hundreds and hundreds of cases. And that really interested me because actually that's exactly what we do for AI, is that we just feed it all of this data and eventually it comes to recognize those patterns. The other thing that I was talking to them about, because I raised the idea of, oh, well, that's exactly what AI does, so how is your job any different? And they were talking about actually it's something that they are worried about in the world of histopathology, that they now need to look at career tracks that are AI proof, because there is AI in some hospitals in America, and they're about to bring it into a hospital in Nottingham as well, to start looking at the more simple cancer slides and to free up histopathologists to do something else. It's not a particularly attractive career or part of medicine, which is possibly why they're so heavily investing in AI, but also they're heavily investing in AI because it's so easily replicated by AI.
Yeah, and I imagine there are a lot more niche things that those professionals could be doing, not just looking at images and saying, yes, cancer, no cancer. They can be talking to people and actually...
So these specific doctors don't have any patient contact.
Right.
What they do genuinely is they look at slides and they tell you what is on the slides. That is it. That is their entire job.
Oh, okay. So their job is effectively being taken by the artificial intelligence.
Yeah, which is why they've been talking about, oh, well, if you go into things like prostate core biopsies, which are much more specialist and require a human eye as opposed to AI. AI isn't as good with those. That's like the route that they're going, is that they're already having to think about AI-proof subspecialities.
Right.
Wow.
You get this idea that all medical professionals talk to patients all the time. But I can see that's not necessarily true. There are a lot of people in the lab just doing analysis, supporting the people that are, I guess, on the front line. It's one way of looking at it.
Yeah, the patient client facing part of medicine.
Those doctors, did they go through the same training that you would have gone through? So the same amount of time and sweat to get to that point?
So we all have the same degree, and then after 2 years of basic training and rotating through hospitals, you then choose what speciality you want to do. So at that point, they will have had a different life compared to me.
In that sense, that means loads more trainee doctors could be free to go to other disciplines. It's just the challenge of people who are already trained in that field will have to find another field which they can apply their skills to.
Yeah, and in a utopia, AI and machines taking our work would mean that we have more free time and the ability to enjoy our lives. But of course, we understand that that's not how society works. So it is a threat to people's livelihoods. And that, I think, is going to be one of the core reasons why if you speak to a doctor, their initial response will be, no, don't like it. This is my job. Only I could ever do this. And AI, of course, is always going to be inferior. But actually, there will be some ways in which it's superior.
So I can see again that being able to diagnose something that frees up time to do something else would be particularly useful. Have you got any specific examples of how it could be superior?
One of the main ways that I think it would be very useful is when you have, for example, healthcare workers who are working in isolation in remote areas. So you're the only doctor for a community. It's useful to be able to bounce ideas off of. Something that we do quite a lot in hospitals is we speak to consultant colleagues about, I've got this really interesting case and I'm not really sure what to do. I think it might be this. I think it might be that. Where should I go with this? And you can kind of have that conversation with an expert opinion. So I think it would definitely, benefit people who are working in isolation. It might also improve access to healthcare. So, for example, if you've got an impoverished community, then AI is going to be cheaper than hiring a doctor. So it could also improve access to healthcare in those sorts of ways. I don't necessarily think that AI would be a superior diagnostician compared to an adequately trained doctor, but you have to train those doctors. So it does then mean that you don't have to train people in that skill anymore. So you can cut out quite a lot of money and effort there if you wanted to. I would argue that becoming overly reliant on AI could be quite dangerous though. Stuff that happens all the time in the NHS, like our servers go down and then we suddenly have no access. Genuinely, we suddenly have no access to things like drug charts, to things like patients' observations, so like their blood pressure and their heart rate. So suddenly we have no access to any of this sort of stuff and we have to go back to being on paper. So if we become overly reliant on AI, we have to have the infrastructure there to support it.
All right.
You touched on a lot of points there. One that I wanted to pick up on was the idea that, it'd be great to have a sort of colleague, inverted commas, as an AI to discuss ideas. But we've also seen like people talk about AI hallucinating and just getting basic facts wrong. That's what people have called it in the industry of it just literally says something that you could look up on a specification, and it says this camera phone has this megapixels, and instead the AI just picks up a random one and just says, nah, it's got like 50 billion.
I have heard this for teaching purposes, essentially. A lot of lecturers were saying that students are using AI to do the coursework for them. And the AI had been set up in a way that it was deliberately putting errors in there so the lecturers could spot it. So I wonder if that's what the hallucination is about.
I'm going to let you into a little trade secret here. The majority of my medical degree was learnt on Wikipedia. One of the skills of being a doctor is not necessarily being able to have the entirety of medical knowledge in your mind, but being able to know where to go to look it up. And you have to retain that skill even when you're using AI. If it outputs something that you go, well, that's a bit weird, you need to have other options to be able to know that it's, giving you the correct answer.
I would agree with that, actually, because I've been a scientist working in labs and supervising students for years now. We would all say the same thing, that it's not that you've got an entire textbook in your head. You definitely have a lot of knowledge in there, and that knowledge helps you infer things from other bits of knowledge that you maybe not quite as familiar with. So it's the same sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
There was something you said fairly near the start about patient-facing roles, essentially. So I have a story from many, many years ago. I went to my GP, my general practitioner, saying, I've got a sore throat, and I've had a sore throat for a while, but I've not been able to do anything about it because of my situation. My situation's now changed, so I can get to you during normal working hours, take a look at it, tell me what's going wrong. So you can definitely see something is wrong back there. And they literally laughed at me. An AI wouldn't have done that.
No.
It would have asked me questions.
Yeah. And Antonia, you actually had a paper that you sent me today saying that AI has been proven to have better bedside manner than doctors. And I can entirely see that. As you said, we all are human. We all have human error. And empathy is proven to be a skill. Communication has proven to be a skill. It can be learnt, but people have to put the effort in to learn it. So, yes, on the one hand, AI would never make a mistake such as outputting ha 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 at you, giving them symptoms.
Unless you trained it to.
Unless you train it to, yes, exactly. unless it's taught on all of our imperfect data. But I also think, as I said, it may be an equal or superior diagnostician, but it will not necessarily be an equal or superior clinician. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of my job is delivering bad news, especially diagnoses of cancer. And for that, you need a very specific amount of tact and the ability to respond to the patient in front of you, to the person in front of you. And yes, probably eventually you could get to the point where if they look down, they're sad, or if they make that very specific twitch of their facial muscles, they want a hug. Eventually the AI will get to that point, but will it ever be able to replace the warmth and the emotion that comes from a real person connecting with you and holding your hand in that moment? I don't think so.
No, I think that human connection is what would make a big difference in a situation like that. And I will say I've been treated by some healthcare professionals who have been absolutely amazing.
You don't have to defend them. It's absolutely fine.
I'm just thinking of some nurse practitioners that have just known exactly what to do and sorted things out for me and just understood what I'm going through without me having to say anything to them other than my arm is swollen and numb, help.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would argue that it's their life experience that means that they're able to provide you with the exact support that you need. And it's their experience of dealing with people who are similar to you. And there's no reason why we can't input that data into an AI.
But do we want to?
Yeah. No.
Is that what we expect? You know, there's also that kind of managing expectations that, you know, someone's always wanting to go, I want a second opinion, I want the person with the most credentials, or do we then start putting AI with the best success rate in front of them and say, well, they've got a 99.9999% correct rate?
True. Which you will never be able to say of a human. Absolutely. I don't know. Thinking about the film AI, the one with Jude Law and the other child actor that I can't remember the name of.
Osmond.
That's it. Yeah.
Haley Osmond.
Haley Joel Osment. That was it. Anyway, AI, that film. Because they had robotic sex workers. They had lots of companion robots who were able to emulate, and then they had AI robot children that were able to emulate those sorts of human connections and human emotions. So I think the fact that we are creating films and literature about it probably means that actually ultimately we will end up wanting it. If you could, and it's something that, I don't know, that I've done with my friends of like, if you could build your perfect man, what would they be like? I mean, if you could build your perfect doctor, what would they be like? And if you could, why wouldn't you? Because they would be perfect.
Yeah, I don't really know what I'd want a doctor to look like. I kind of only go to them when I'm told to, really. Like, I've got an implant that needs to be replaced every 3 years, and I get letters saying you have to go for this test. It's not often I get ill or think I've got something that says I've got symptoms, I should go to visit my GP or sit in an emergency room. So I don't know, I've not had a lot of experience on that front to be able to say what I'd want them to look like. Or like most of what I see is what I see on TV. That's probably not very representative, Grey's Anatomy.
Yeah. Antonia?
Yeah, I have been to the doctor about all sorts, and also just when I had a niggle, you know, when I wasn't really sure what it is, but it had some sort of measurable impact on my life, like, you know, can't sleep as well because of said thing. And they do take a while to get to the bottom of it, you know. There's a bit of trial and error that because, you know, it's not always obvious what it is. And I think part of it was during COVID as well, where we didn't have face-to-face interaction. And so there was a little bit of like, well, we had Ask My GP, so you could send photos, which felt really weird. Like, here's this weird patch on my elbow. Can you please see what it is? And they'll be like, I can't really see anything. It doesn't look that bad. And I'm trying to describe it with my vague, non-common medical terms because I feel like, you know, doctors have that like measure of, is it a stabbing pain? Is it a throbbing pain? Is it a sharp pain? And I'm like, I don't know.
I've never been stabbed.
Yeah. This is my own experience of pain. So, yeah, it's almost like you need a doctor to be able to interpret your human foibles. Because, like, if an AI is only very good at understanding very precise instruction, and we are imprecise with our descriptions, then they would have to figure it out, you know?
But I guess the argument is that over time, with enough data put in, they would learn that, you know, the majority of people, when they say this, they mean this. And if it's unclear, then they ask clarifying questions.
I can see that getting really frustrating though, especially like on the point Antonia made about pain. If you're sitting there saying, well, it's kind of stabbing, but I don't know, it also throbs as well, and it's like, which is it? Is it stabbing or throbbing? Just pick one.
But yeah, and I feel like I'm defending AI a lot, but then you would train it to say, okay, that's it, let's move on from that question, because that's exactly what a doctor would do, is they would just say, you're getting frustrated by this, let's move on, let's talk about something else.
But it's an interesting point though. Can you train AI to be, I was going to say more human than a doctor with no empathy? I'm not sure that's what I want to say though.
I mean, I remember reading somewhere, but it might be apocryphal, so please forgive me. But surgeons have a higher rate of psychopaths than any other profession.
Because they like the stabbing. Hit theme now.
Potentially. I mean, we teach set phrases to medical students on how to respond to uncomfortable outpourings from patients. Uncomfortable for the patients, uncomfortable for them. So you say things like, that must be really hard, or I can see why that would be difficult for you, or yes, I get why that's frustrating. Like you teach them very set phrases, but if you don't apply them correctly with the correct like vocal tone and with the correct facial expression, it does come out like AI is just giving you, yes, I can see why that's hard.
Oh, that did sound a bit patronising. Don't do
that. Talking about training them and pouring information into them.
You mean the AI, not the junior doctors?
Yeah, not the junior doctors, no. Training AI and pouring data into AI. How much data is enough? How much data is too much? How much of our private lives should we be putting into these machines? How secure is it? Who has access to it? Who has the right to read it? And at what point are we allowed to just not know stuff about ourselves? Like for example, if we put people's DNA and family history and medical history and everything else in that, at what point it might come up saying, oh, you're at risk of X, Y, and Z. Do they have to know that? Do I have to know that?
Or what if it knows it and tries to steer you towards it because you don't want to know?
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah. That's a very circular argument.
Yeah.
I guess a good example of what you're saying is there's a TV program, it's on Netflix, I think, called The Bold Type. It's about 3 youngish women making their way in publishing in New York. And one of them says, I think her mother might have had breast cancer, and she ended up getting herself checked to see if she had the gene. And she did, and she got a bit paranoid about it. It was doing all these checks and whatever else, and eventually decided to get a mastectomy so she didn't have to worry about it. And she thought that would solve the problem. But she obviously got implants to replace what had been removed, and then she started to feel like it wasn't her own body, and she was uncomfortable, and there was nothing she could do about it. And I think if I were in that situation, I wouldn't want to know. I'd rather take my chances, because just because you have a gene doesn't mean you will get cancer, right? There are other factors at play.
But what if it becomes so good at predicting that it just knew because it's had so much information that the chance of it being wrong was so little?
If it could say with like 90% certainty that given your environment, your habits, your genetics, and all this other information that's not directly relevant to me, well, I have to sit there and think, well, if I am going to get cancer and I can avoid it, maybe I should, maybe I wouldn't want to, I don't know. Maybe I'd be happy with waiting for that point and then having it removed when the time came. I don't know.
I suppose it's, on the one hand, you have a right to know and make an informed choice with your own body. On the other hand, it's the right to be ignorant, because ignorance is bliss. And if you know that you're likely to die of a heart attack at 75, that's so far away, but it's always going to be hanging over your head if you now know that. Compared to if you were just blissfully up until the age of 75 living your life, and then, one day you just don't wake up.
On a lighter note,
Sorry.
Fair enough, because I was going to continue down that maudlin vein, so go on, Antonia.
this kind of thought process was applied in the Black Mirror episode Hang the DJ, which was where a couple had an app and they got a number, and it turned out that number represented how long the app expected them to be together. So if you knew the number right from when you met, how would you play out that relationship? Would it change the way you treated that relationship?
Absolutely. If an app told me, oh, you'll be together 5 years and then break up, I'd be like, no, I'm just not going to bother. I'm not going to spend 5 years in a relationship that's going to end.
See, I'd go the other way, and I'd want to know why it was saying that and try and beat that number. I'd say, you're not telling me it's going to last like this. It's going to be different. It has to be different. I refuse to believe that's true.
Nah. But and maybe on the side of things, is that a sign that there are some people like me who will put their entire faith in what the computer tells them when it could be wrong? And are there people out there who will say, oh, I'm going to die age 50 of MS. No, I'm going to kill myself at 40 so I don't have to live that last 10 years. And what if it's wrong? How much faith are we going to end up putting in AI? And that is a danger, that we shouldn't believe that computers are perfect, AI is perfect, because ultimately it is based on human fallibility.
So I guess you'd want some way of also training it to see when it's been fed something based on something that's a fallacy. I really don't know how you do that, though.
I guess you could always you do it with the caveat of like, the same way that people are, oh, that's just my opinion though. Of, you have a caveat of, this is AI and we cannot promise that it's perfect or whatever. And in the same way that, whenever I'm counselling patients, I always say, based on the information that I have, this is what I think is going on. Therefore, this is what I would recommend. And there will be risks with everything, and it might not turn out like this. You might end up having this problem, doing thorough counselling on the risks and benefits of AI opinions.
And are they better than human opinions?
Or are they still just opinions? I guess from my side, I always see my opinion as just that, just my opinion. This is my professional opinion. But do patients ever see the advice the doctors give them as an opinion, or do they see it as gospel?
That is true. I guess it depends on your experience with them.
I think some people just straight up don't listen if it's not what they wanted to hear, right? Like, you've been told you should cut this out of your diet because it's increasing your risk, and people don't. Like, people know doctors are right, but ultimately they don't follow it.
Ultimately, they want to eat that lamb dish, even though it's going to make their gout worse. Yes.
Yes. This friend who spent a long time trying to get this swollen ankle diagnosed, and it makes me wonder, if they had AI, or the doctor had AI, would it have spotted it faster? Because it was like sooner than the typical time that you would get this condition. And also, he didn't like going to the doctor because he couldn't walk. So he would just go, it's a bit awkward now. And then, when you go to a doctor and you say, oh, I need to see a doctor about this. Well, the next appointment's like 2 weeks away. And by the time that 2-week appointment comes up, you're like, it's gone. But it comes back. And so you'd book another appointment and then it's gone again. And so they never actually get to observe it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point in that this friend of ours who's been diagnosed with gout, he is very young to have gotten gout. He is not the typical sort of person to get gout either. So usually you associate gout with older white men, generally, who drink a lot, eat a lot of meat, like think like old-timey ship's captains. That's generally who
Or Henry VIII.
Or Henry VIII, yeah, exactly. That's generally who gets gout. And he doesn't fit any of those stereotypes. So would a computer that's purely basing it on pattern recognition ever come to that diagnosis? Would it come to it quicker based on some unknown variables that we haven't inputted yet? So the histopathologists I was talking to, they were saying that actually the AI now uses criteria that they don't know it's using for it. Like, it's hard to describe it. Basically, they inputted the criteria that they've taught trainees, and it's also using some extra criteria that it can't explain that it's using. So would eventually AI get to the point where it would come to these conclusions quicker because it has picked up extra patterns that we don't see as clinicians?
But then could that ever be the absolute truth? Because you couldn't explain it.
Well, I'm just wondering if this goes back to what Sarah was saying about you wouldn't just rely on the AI alone for various reasons. So if you can get it to explain to you so it can teach you what it's looking out for.
Yeah.
Because I guess that's similar with people. Like, well, that looks like cancer to me, but I can't really explain why that's cancer. I just know that it is. Trust me.
Yeah.
This is my opinion.
Yeah. Trust me, I'm a doctor. Yeah. I'm imagining this 200, 300 years in the future is what I'm imagining, where you have AI practitioners who are operating independently. And at that point, I do wonder whether it would come to these sorts of realizations sooner, or whether, I think definitely in the short term, it probably would never have considered it as a differential because it doesn't fit the standard patterns.
I guess there are always going to be outliers in the data because our understanding of the human body and, well, the entire world isn't perfect yet anyway. Yeah. There are still lots of things that we don't know, and there are still lots of extra patterns to spot. And I guess that's also where some of the biases come in healthcare already. Like, for example, women's problems are often underlooked. People of ethnic minorities in a white country have particular likely outcomes that white people don't get. And that goes back to what you're saying about training it to already have bias because the data set is limited.
Yeah, absolutely.
To end on a slightly lighter and more futuristic note, I've heard little bits about advances in surgery and like doing things that you would never have thought possible before, like using little robotic arms to do things and microscopic images so you can see things with incredible detail. Is that something that you combine with AI? So you've basically got a robot doing surgery on people with no human intervention.
So I spoke to a couple of my colleagues. So I spoke to one person who is the head of robotics at Leicester, University Hospitals of Leicester. And he was saying that the main issue for humans is there's no haptic feedback during robotic surgery because you're essentially, it's like piloting a remote control car. There's no, like, you can't feel when the car goes over a bump or, turns upside down. You just have to see it and then base it on what you're seeing.
This is why I don't like computer games. No feedback of that type. I obviously need the haptic feedback and not just the visual.
Yeah. Whereas with laparoscopic, at least you get some haptic feedback because you're directly touching stuff. So, sorry, for laparoscopic, it's keyhole surgery. So you're using a camera and looking inside using very small holes, but you're still touching things directly. Whereas robotic, it's a computer attached to that equipment. And then you're, I don't know, a couple of meters away controlling that robot.
With like a little, joystick and
two joysticks, genuinely two joysticks that move in 3 directions that you can control all of the different instruments with.
Oh, so you've got no idea if you're touching something that's quite squishy.
Yeah, and it's all based on your prior knowledge of what anatomical structures are where, which you could easily program into AI.
Or you could map it. You know, in this futuristic world, you don't even need to give it an estimation. You could just scan them.
True. Very true. Yeah, you could do an MRI and then you could program that into a robot and away it goes. That's very true, actually. In which case, if you were to do that, that would actually overcome quite a lot of the stuff, quite a lot of the arguments against AI and robotic surgery, because the main problem is having the confidence to cut something when you're unsure what it is. So when you lift something up, for example, and you go, well, I know it can't be this, I know it can't be that, and this other really important structure, I know it can't be any of that, so it's nothing important, so I can just cut it. And that is a bit of confidence.
The idea you have non-important things in your body is a bit...
Well...
But yeah, like the appendix.
Yeah.
But the appendix wouldn't be there. But yeah, let's just cut it out. Don't need it.
Sorry.
Anyway.
Sorry. So it's having that confidence to know that there aren't any vital structures that you're going to go through, basically. And would an AI ever be able to independently make those sorts of assumptions? And I suppose eventually you would get the technology to the point where you could do an MRI scan, but you would have to have a surgeon label every single structure as cut here, don't cut here, important, not important. Because, it's been, anecdotally found that nurse practitioners, nurse surgeons, nurse operators don't have the confidence to cut without having a surgeon there saying, yes, to take it. And having a person there to take that risk for them. I feel like AI probably wouldn't do risk very well.
Yeah, I can see why. People have that kind of measure of how much risk they're willing to take. Whereas in AI, we kind of say like, if it was a programmer, they might say, okay, let's say 99.99999% absolute. But then do we get in a world where these robotic surgeons go into the operating theatre and then go,
yeah,
that's a little bit too borderline for me.
Yeah, exactly.
Everyone, get back out. We're coming out of this.
Yeah, and risk in surgery is basically the whole premise of surgery is risk management. So what is the risk if we don't do the operation? What is the risk if we do? What is the risk if we do this specific operation versus a different type versus if we just do this or we just do that? So I think risk management is going to be a big area that AI will struggle with. But then there's other stuff that's taking out surgery as a required speciality, which obviously we won't go into here.
Future episodes maybe, especially the idea about risk, which is our very first episode talking about what risk means to us over 2 years ago now.
Yeah.
We didn't go into that much depth though. Would an AI be able to judge risk?
To sum up my opinion on this whole AI thing, AI in healthcare, AI is built and trained on imperfect data from imperfect humans. Therefore, expecting perfection from AI is impossible. We shouldn't expect perfection from AI. And there is no such thing as perfection in the human world. So also don't expect perfection from your doctors.
Well, that just reminds me of the chaos theory episode where we said, with enough variables and enough computing power, we could almost put a theory to predict something like this. But will we ever get to that point where we have enough computing power to do that? Good question. What do you recommend for people trying to train AI to be a better doctor? Because, there are pros and cons to it. We've talked about a lot of cons, but they seem to be, if we could work it out, we're very early stage in it. So what do you think should be taken into consideration today for the future?
What would be the ideal clinician? And then from that, build the AI into that. So you don't just think about a diagnostician, because we're basically there already with AI. You also have to think about personalized management plans. You also have to think about communication with patients. You also have to think about the AI's own resilience and ability to deal with the workload. You have to think about the way that it interacts with other healthcare workers and the system in general. That is probably what I'd recommend, is think about what your ideal is and build the AI towards that in a holistic way.
So like any good project management.
Yeah, Exactly.
Great. Okay, so we've covered a lot of different things about AI and how it could impact healthcare today, or how it already impacts healthcare. Thank you, Sarah, for sharing your experiences.
You're welcome.
I hope we continue to have great conversations like this in other episodes.
The views expressed in this podcast belong entirely to the person that said them. They do not represent any industry or organisation. If you enjoyed listening to these views, it would really help us out if you could rate us, leave a review and tell a friend. This podcast was sponsored by no one, but if you're interested in funding us to continue to have frank discussions about science and engineering, please get in touch.